Now imagine the following were true. Imagine, which is what we're going to spend the next few minutes talking about. Imagine that this was always the way evolution worked. Imagine that crisis is always an evolutionary driver, right? Always, right? And imagine that our crisis is always a birth. And imagine that every crisis is actually at its core a crisis of intimacy. And imagine that this is actually not new. That this is actually the movement of evolution itself. That actually that this moment in history, we're facing not an ordinary crisis, that's true, we're facing a meta-crisis. That's why we call it the meta-crisis. It's a meta-crisis. It's exponentially unlike anything we've ever seen. And because we have exponentialized technology creates exponential suck, if I can use the Latin term. Right? Right? Bows and arrows, okay. Atom bomb, not such a big deal, right? Because it takes an entire country, right? You need state capacities to enrich uranium, transport uranium, right? To actually create the possibility of actually manifesting an actual nuclear device and then detonating it and maintaining it. All right, atom bomb, we can kind of handle that. We did sort of maybe. Wasn't easy. It almost went off a bunch of times. There's been a lot of writing about that, but somehow we managed. That's not where we are now. The atom bomb was child's play. We're at weaponized drone technologies, right? We're at rogue non-state actors playing with new protocols of artificial intelligence, right? Nick Bostrom wrote in 2019 a very important essay called The Vulnerability Hypothesis, where he said, what happens if you reach into culture and you get a white ball? Oh, great, white ball, great new technology. What if you get a gray ball? Gray ball is like a mix. I would identify Bostrom's gray ball with social media. It's a lot of greatness to it, and it's gray ball. We've talked about, right? What if you get a black ball? What's a black ball? A black ball is an exponentially weaponized technology that can be made in a short amount of time, stay close, which takes place away from the eyes of appropriately surveilling parties, right? Meaning you can make it quickly, a couple of months. It can be made by rogue, not state actors, and you can't actually track who's making it. That's a black ball. Right? What's that? And how do we deal with that? Now, I want to just stay close for a second. Stay close, and it's really crazy important that we're going to come back to our thread. And so, for example, the notion that we're trying to create surveillance in the world today, which you go on the web or you read Shoshana Zuboff's Surveillance Capitalism, which says the demon of surveillance is wrong. Because it's a surprising thing to hear. We actually need surveillance. That's Nick Bostrom's point. We need some way of having eyes. People forget that. So the entire kind of like literature on the web, no surveillance. Whoa, if we don't have eyes, we're fucked. But if you have surveillance without first values and first principles, then you have totalitarianism in its worst form. And so Shoshana Zuboff writes this fantastic book called Surveillance Capitalism, but she forgets to explain that actually there's 10 reasons why we need surveillance, which she completely ignores, and doesn't actually articulate a vision that would enable us to have eyes with first values and first principles. Wow. Bracket. Let's get back to our track. So if the root cause of the generator functions of existential risk, rivalrous conflict based on win-lose metrics, and complicated, fragile systems instead of complex systems, if the root cause is a global intimacy disorder, so we need to evolve intimacy. How do we evolve intimacy? So how do you evolve intimacy? So let's say you're in a couple. And a couple can be two friends. It can be, Rob, you're working with a company, right? You're working in a group, right? What is the structure of intimacy, let's say in a couple, any kind of couple? Right? The core structure of intimacy in a couple is they need some sort of shared story. If there's they don't have to agree on everything, but if they don't have some, what Huxley called in 1944, if they don't have some kind of minimum working hypothesis, right? It's some basic shared story about their past, their present, and their future. They don't have to agree on everything, but they need some sort of shared story. If you don't have a shared story within a couple, it breaks down. Right? It might break down into deadness, in which people die into their deadness and die at 95, dead to each other, fundamentally. It might actually break up. But if you want a couple to remain a vibrant, throbbing, right, expression and articulation of Eros, right, and Eros might mean that it might be a couple that never has sex, but they're madly in love. But it's not about how you do it. It's not about sex. It's not about sex. It's about Eros. This is about, but if you want to have a couple enamored with Eros, right, that look in each other's eyes, they've got to be in some sort of shared story. If they're not in a shared story, intimacy breaks down. So the way you create intimacy is that you actually live within a shared story. You get that? Now, sometimes that had shadow versions. So let's say ethnocentric nationalism in the 14th century was a shadow version of a shared story. We all believe a fundamentalist shared story, but therefore we're willing to die for each other. Do you get what I mean? It's like, whoa, right? It's like a big deal. Yeah, but it actually allows you to see the power of a shared story. Right? We have a shared story, right? Only a particular version of believing in Christ gets you to heaven, right? Any other version takes you straight to hell. And so we're going to have Protestant Catholic wars, a 30-year war in Europe that rips Europe apart around which version of the shared story is right, and we're all willing to die and kill each other, and our brothers and our sisters, right, for that sake. So that's the shadow version of the power of a shared story. Right? But a shared story, right, is actually essential to creating intimacy. But you need a shared story of value rooted in first values and first principles, and that story has to evolve. It has to be an evolving story. We'll talk about that a couple of days from now. Okay? So what's the direct hit? Do we have a drum roll in the house? Do we have a drum roll? Thank you for listening. Do we have a drum roll? We have a drum roll in the house. Cheap seats in the back. Do we have a drum roll? The direct hit, right, the Death Star direct hit is, can we articulate, right, a shared story of value? And if we can take this home. Right? If we can, that story can spread. Right? But for the story to be declared, and I always said this to Barbara, for the story to be declared, it can't be like, I claim this story. This is the story. That's totalitarianism. Right? You can't impose a story. The story has to well up from the actual structures of value in reality itself. Okay? Right? It's got to be a story of value rooted in first principles and first values.